welcome to the panel for the OneRing.net. We are the longest standing, largest Tolkien Lord of the Rings fan website on the internet. We've been around since 1998, actually, when news of the films first came out. And I think that makes us 21, 22 years old, which is kind of remarkable for a fan website. And we're still active because new things keep happening. Briefly, I'm just going to mention we are joined by Nicole Roberts and Abby Ekenezer, who are here in West Coast, Cliff, who is currently down in Florida, and Tolkien biographer John Garth as a special guest. So hi, John. And he's coming to us from the UK, and I'm going to let Cliff take it away from here regarding the book.
Yes. Well, everyone, we have a very, very special guest with us. Anytime that we have someone from the true world of Tolkien scholarship, as opposed to, you know, my wheelhouse, which is the armchair version of Tolkien scholarship, it is exquisite to have your mind and your perspectives here with us, Mr. Garth, the author of The Worlds of J.R.R. Tolkien, recently published after a minor delay this year from COVID-19. And this is a new publication which everyone has been very, very excited about in a year that continues to have very large news in the Tolkien universe. This is a book that lets us explore the places, the physical places in Tolkien's life in the primary world, which give us very keen insights into the development of the secondary world as well. Mr. Garth, welcome. It's great to have you here.
Thank you very much.
Yes, indeed. Now, tell us, everyone knows a little bit, if you've read the letters, you know, if you've read Mr. Carpenter's biography of Tolkien, we all know a little bit about Tolkien's trip when he was hiking in the Alps and his experiences of that rock slide that inspired, you know, that chapter in The Hobbit, out of the frying pan into the fire. But there's so much more. There's so much more. Please tell our viewership, where is some of the best places to begin looking for Tolkien's inspirations?
Well, literally everywhere that touched Tolkien's life and mind, I would say. There's an awful lot of talk about places that inspired Tolkien, particularly online and in the news media. And it tends very much to get hijacked by local enthusiasms, including tourist boards and publicans and so on. So there are pubs that claim to be the inspiration of the Prancing Pony, though there's no evidence Tolkien ever visited the pub. There are two towers that were around the corner from Tolkien when he was a kid. But there's a very complex story behind how Tolkien came up with the how the title "The Two Towers" was arrived at, and there's no reason to think it had any connection with those particular two towers that stood near him as a child. So my book is an attempt to explore places he visited. So yes, the journey to Switzerland actually features on the cover. That's not Rivendell, it's the Valley of Lauterbrunnen, which Tolkien's own drawings, that's by an artist called Flo Snook, of the real place. Tolkien's own drawings of Rivendell are very reminiscent of that. And you can tell from the place name itself, Lauterbrunnen, that Tolkien has played with that in the river names Loudwater and Brunnen.
Yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So my work has been to draw strands together to see what makes sense as likely or certain inspirations for various things. Obviously, Oxford and the counties that Tolkien knew and loved, England itself, hugely important, especially if you look at the early versions of his mythology. And where I start the book with Tolkien arriving in England. He was born in southern Africa, arriving in England as a 3-year-old and being overwhelmed by the different climate, the green, the temperate weather, and the countryside. And
Sarehole Mill, of course.
Yes, so he lived in an area called Sarehole, a tiny little village, when he was very young, and there was no motorist. It was before motorized transport. There were no street lights. You know, it was very, very Shire-like, at least from a perspective of a 7-year-old, 4-year-old. You know. He wouldn't have been aware of the fact that it was in economic decline at the time, things like that. But he brings that childlike innocence back into play with the Shire, and with it wasn't even called the Shire in The Hobbit when he invented it for his children. And I think what Tolkien was doing there is drawing back to his own childhood so that he could bring something out that his children could relate to share with them his own childhood.
Why now? Why is this the time to publish this research? I'm curious.
Because this is the time when I got it done. Frankly, the book was kind of accidental in the sense that I was working on another book, which is yet to be finished, about Tolkien's works as a dialogue with the crises of his own times. And in the course of researching that, I found myself coming up with quite a lot of material that was related to the inspiration of particular places. And a friend of mine who writes books for this particular publisher, Francis Lincoln in the UK, said they would love a book about places that inspired Tolkien. So that's how it came about. It's great right now because actually, if you've been locked down, if you feel unable to travel but you'd love to, you can travel through the book to all these places. You can travel in Tolkien's imagination, as far as I can reconstruct it, and you can, and you're in the company, not so much of me, but of Tolkien himself, who was a man who did most of his traveling in his memory and imagination, right? So he took that Swiss journey of 1911. He was 19 then, and he used it when writing The Hobbit, probably not early 1930s. And used it in Lord of the Rings 1940s. You know, he kept drawing on that set of experiences that remained extraordinarily vivid to him.
Because he didn't go back. He didn't travel as frequently as many of us may have think that he did.
Right. So here's another error that's often made is to say, well, Tolkien visited Ireland, therefore various areas of Ireland must have inspired the Lord of the Rings because they look like we imagine Lord of the Rings landscapes to look like. Well, unfortunately that falls down because he didn't visit Ireland really until after he'd finished his work on Lord of the Rings. There's no way around that, you know.
And I was just gonna cut in and say I'm a travel agent, and so the idea of a book that can help inspire people of here's a new list of items to put on your bucket list, because you're right, coming from South Africa to England was a big transition, obviously, but going someplace with mountains like the Alps and seeing the Alps for the first time must have been transformative, because you land anywhere in a large mountain range and it's just so different than living in cities and towns and with rolling green hills.
Well, one of the things that I found also was that on his voyage from Southern Africa, which he could remember vividly bits of it.
Really? At the age of 3?
At the age of 3, yeah. He remembered seeing the Indian Ocean. He remembered the harbour, probably at Cape Town. He remembered a city of lights on a hill, which he thought later was probably Lisbon. And I found that the ship also docked in Madeira and Tenerife. And these are both volcanic islands. You know, they stand up from the sea, very isolated, and we repeatedly see he's obsessed with the idea of these, you know, isolated little islands that have stories and associated with them. He brings stories to them.
Tall Erisea. Did I say it right?
You did, not bad.
Not bad. But imagine, he had in his imagination a moving island that would traverse the great seas.
Yeah,
I can
so
see.
here's another aspect. You should never think that Tolkien only took things from experience. Right, now obviously he did not visit a moving island. There are moving islands, however, in Irish mythology. So if he was drawing from Ireland, that was his connection, you know.
Mm, mm. Well, your earlier book, Tolkien and the Great War, which is my favorite, it's a great resource, especially for people last year who got to sink their teeth into the Fox Searchlight feature film starring Nicholas Hoult and Lily Collins, which we spoke a lot of over the time of its release. The fans got a very romanticized and, of course, fictionalized adaptation of those years of Tolkien and his relationship with the TCBS and his friends and fellow students. But to read your book, you get a much greater insight, into the real events of the war. And that focus is a fantastic and important chapter in what brought his fertile imagination to where it would eventually go. In your new book, where's the biggest surprise you found in your research that might have raised your eyebrows and thought, well, I didn't know that?
The one that really excited me was discovering the tower, which I believe inspired the elf towers west of the Shire, and also, in a really curious way, Orthanc. So in fact, Christopher Tolkien in his History of Middle-earth traces a line between the elf towers west of the Shire and Orthanc, and the line is quite simple. Tolkien didn't quite know what to do with the idea that Gandalf wasn't around to accompany Frodo and co on the way to Rivendell. So he came up with various versions of that story. And one of them had Gandalf besieged by Black Riders in one of those elf towers west of the Shire. And then and Frodo dreams about this. And then he transplanted that so that Gandalf is held captive in Orthanc, right? Frodo dreams about that. And you can see there's a trace, there's almost like an embedded fossil of the dream where Frodo walks up a hill towards a tower, and suddenly there's a bright light. Well, that's a fragment from the earlier draft where he's about to see the tower in which Gandalf is imprisoned, is besieged. So those are the connections that Christopher Tolkien traced. You can also see a connection then going back to the invention of the story of Numenor, which was end of 1936, 1937, where Tolkien devises the idea of these towers. They're originally, in his imagination, to have been built by the exiled men of Numenor after the destruction of Numenor, so that they could look west at the land that once was and towards the eternal west. Now, the wonderful thing is that I realized that in turn goes back to the landmark lecture on the Old English epic poem Beowulf that Tolkien had presented at the end of 1936. So just when he was coming up with the Numenor thing, just before he came up with the Numenor story. In that Beowulf lecture, he has an allegory. We all know Tolkien hated allegory, but in this instance, he used it. He has an allegory which is used to describe the state of scholarship into Beowulf. And I'm not going to explain the allegory because it'll take too much time. But the image is a man builds a tower. His neighbors, not understanding why he's built that tower, push it over and start examining the stones for evidence of ancient history, archaeology, and so on. But he says, from the top of that tower, that man could see the sea. Right. So you've got the tower, right, and the view of the sea, the fantastic view. Now, as it happens, just before Tolkien gave that lecture, there was a major well-reported planning dispute very near Oxford, 18 miles away from Oxford, where Tolkien lived, where a tower was built. The neighbours opposed it. They did not know what it was there for. They didn't want it to be built. Thankfully, it remained standing. It wasn't knocked down, right? But I'm convinced that Tolkien, in giving his lecture, would have known that the audience was familiar with this news story. It was local. It was even national because it was being built by a famous man called Lord Berners. And that he would have played that in his lectures for laughs. So there is the origin of the tower in Beowulf, and that leaps into the Numenor story, and that leaps into the Lord of the Rings. So you've got a really curious thread of inspiration there, and I find it fascinating. And the reason I found out about this is because I saw in another book this picture, which reminded me so much of Tolkien's picture of Hobbiton.
Yes, it does.
With the angular building in the foreground and the windy road going through houses and trees and so on, up to the rounded hill, and of course the puffy clouds and everything like that. It's kind of generic, but the fact is that painting is of the tower that I've just spoken about that had just been built, and it was used in advertising on the sides of trucks owned by the Shell oil company that provided petrol to gas stations in Britain at that time. So all kinds of really interesting connections there.
Yeah, and things that Tolkien wouldn't have, I mean, trucks for gas stations and
Right, yeah.
and
seems
things that pollute.
Really ironic.
Yeah, very orcish behavior.
It's the process of inspiration is very complex, but actually, one of the things that I found in researching the book is that the car in the 1930s was changing Britain's idea about its own landscape. So the Shell oil company was using the British landscape to draw people out from the suburbs and from the cities in their cars to discover their heritage. And Tolkien did this. They had a family car, and they drove around Oxfordshire and beyond.
Yes, I've often wondered about what it would have been like if Professor Tolkien had ever done something similar to Oscar Wilde, who in 1882 did a famous lecture tour of America. Most fans might not know that John Ronald never traveled once to the US of A. And I've just, in my personal imagination, I've always wondered what it would have been like if the great professor himself had made such a lecture tour in America, and if any of the places he would have seen here in our continent here would have inspired him.
I think if he'd had the chance to go into the wildernesses, absolutely, yeah.
Mm-hmm. He would have loved the geothermal springs in Yellowstone.
Right, yeah. So there's another phrase is his fascination with volcanism.
Yeah. Plus, I think California's the Yosemite, Muir Woods, the sequoias. I think he would have been fascinated by the sequoias, the giant trees, because they're just so big.
Closest thing to Malorns we could have.
Yeah.
That's great. Well, let's ask anybody else on the panel who would like. Before I go into the Numenor question, I've always wondered about the Atlantis connection to Numenor. But before we go there, does anybody else have a question for Mr. Garth?
I do. You can always count on me to have a question. I'm curious whether you think it's interesting because you kind of have given me a little bit of a different perspective on this than I've had recently in talking about how relatively little Tolkien had the opportunity to travel a great deal in Europe and other places. But what are your thoughts on his his rejection of industrialization and modernization, do you think that that reflected more of a sense of privilege, or was it more aspirational based on the fact that he didn't have the opportunity to go and experience natural wonders and whatnot as much as we might think he did based on the fantasy worlds that he created?
I'm not sure I can answer all of that question. I can certainly say where I think his opposition to industrialization came from. One is, you know, he saw it happening around him during his lifetime. He saw the arrival of the motor car. He saw how it changed Oxford, for example. He saw how the spread of suburbia, which was a product of the motor car, overran the village of Sarehole, where he'd spent such a happy childhood, part of his childhood. He saw the use of industrialized machinery in the trenches of the First World War, weapons of mass slaughter used against people. Yeah, he was and I think this is really important. So Tolkien at one time, and probably still, has been derided by some people as being an arch nostalgist who has nothing to say about the real world.
I hate it when they do that.
Well, frankly, that's because they're on the other side, right? They're on the side of what they would call progress, and they think that it's all important. I think that it's all important that we should listen to voices from Tolkien's era, because he was one of the last witnesses, along with, of course, other people of his generation, to the time, the cusp, when the world tipped into mass use, mass personalized use of industrialized things.
But isn't that a little bit, I mean, that goes back to what I was saying about the notion of privilege. I mean, you know,
well, that's where I didn't understand what you were driving at there. Perhaps.
Well, I mean, his idealized existence is demonstrated really in Bilbo, and then, excuse me, Frodo's lifestyle is sort of a landed gentry, you know, gentleman living in the country and not having presumably relatively unlimited resources without actually having to do any work himself. Presumably he inherited this, you know, and he's just got this leisure time to enjoy the country, and it's easy for him to then be, and him being the generic sort of Bilbo archetype, to enjoy the country and those privileges to which he has access, and to decry the nature of this industrial advancement that is, while definitely being damaging to the environment, but is also democratizing space and land in a way that it hadn't been before. I mean, you talk about the rise of the suburbs. I mean, but that's aspirational for many people, to be able to get out of the city and have a space that's got a little bit of greenery. And, you know, it's to say that that was anathema to him is implying that he was, you know, he was opposed to the idea of other people being able to participate in the same kind of privilege.
Yeah, I don't think Tolkien was so unrealistic, and he certainly accepted that change happens. It's all very well going into mourning about the vanishing past, but it's going to happen anyway. That's the story of the elves, right? Yeah. No one could pretend that Tolkien presents a program for life any more than he presents a strategic guidebook for winning wars, right? So the Lord of the Rings, the war in the Lord of the Rings is won because they chuck a ring down a mountain. Right? We can't do that. They renounce power. It's a fairy tale. But he would say that the value of the fairy tale goes far beyond practicality. It's about awakening the imagination. It's about awakening the memory of what it's like to be in connection with the land. And I would say that these are vitally important things. If we forget those, it's in our efforts to rush forward and, you know, give everyone factory foods, give everyone cars, and so on, something will be permanently lost to all of us and our descendants, and it is happening.
Indeed. Indeed. The concept of Numenor is actually in everyone's mind now, because the popular fandom has a very strong awareness, I think, that Amazon Studios is getting ready to, well, they're endeavoring, for good or for ill, they are endeavoring to bring us new stories from the Second Age. We're not quite sure what shape or form this mischief might take, but in his studies as a youth, we know that Tolkien would have been exposed to all the classics and the Greeks and Plato's original writings about Atlantis. But from what I remember in Humphrey Carpenter's biography, Professor Tolkien didn't really take a cotton to that stuff with the Hellenistic, the classics. He was more interested in a lot of other things, a lot of other branches of linguistic study and folklore and legends. So is it surprising to you, John? Is it surprising to any of us that Numenor would be so specifically based on a real, our own awareness of Atlantis and its mythology in our world? It's still surprising to me.
Well, first of all, I think it's Tolkien's relationship with the classical world is misunderstood.
Perhaps, yes.
He said that his taste for poetry was awoken by work in Latin and Greek translation. And his taste in epic was awoken by Virgil and Homer. The problem was Tolkien had read everything that was to be read, that was available in the classics, before he went on to study classics at Oxford University. And so in those years he got bored. And he was, in the meantime, because he had such a prolific and hungry mind, gobbling up other languages, Germanic languages, and then Finnish, Welsh. So he moved out of the familiar on an adventure of his own. That doesn't mean you don't like the familiar anymore. It just means that it's not the engine that's driving you forward so much. I think, well, I have, I've done some work on the origin of the Numenor story, and I believe that it can be pinned down to a very, very short span of days in the early weeks of December 1936, which happened to coincide with the abdication crisis in Britain, where the king stood down and his brother had to take over. This was earth-shaking for the British Constitution, British traditions and so on. Never happened before. It was also the year of the collapse of the structures that had guaranteed peace, or had been trying to guarantee peace since 1918, since the end of the Great War, as they called it. So Italy under Mussolini had invaded Ethiopia, Abyssinia, as they called it. And Germany, Nazi Germany, had marched back into the Rhineland, which had been established as a demilitarized zone to protect the neighboring France. The world looked very, very rocky, and the Spanish Civil War was already raging.
Oh, yes.
Yes.
And Tolkien was very engaged in the Spanish Civil War emotionally, because it was partly a religious conflict, and he was a Catholic. He stood very much on the side of the monarchy, the Catholic Church, against the side that tends to be regarded as being the right side, the International Brigades, those who were fighting for a more progressive or democratic or anarchistic or whatever way of life. So why did Tolkien pick Atlantis? Because he had this accident when he was working on Elvish. He was revising some of the rules that build words in Elvish. And he already had root words meaning various things. And one of these root words was lanta, to fall. And fiddling around with his word building rules, he suddenly realized that according to these new rules, lanta would naturally create a noun, Atalante, meaning fallen, something that has fallen, something that is in ruins.
Atalante. Now,
Atalante. He had a eureka moment. And you can see this because he was writing a technical handwritten dictionary of Elvish roots, which was all pretty, I wouldn't say boring because I love this. But it wasn't packed with story. But all of a sudden, in the middle of this, he starts writing Atalante, the land that was destroyed and fell, and he keeps starting new sentences and then breaking them off, and then he writes an outline of the whole story, and it's all there. A very crude version of what later came, but it seems to me that it expresses the dire frustration and sorrow of a survivor of the First World War, seeing civilization squandering its gains and benefits, squandering its peace.
Indeed. That's good stuff. Is Atalante Sindarin or Quenya?
No, it's Quenya.
It's Quenya. I thought so. Okay. the high end Latin, the high Latin version of Elvish, as they
That's
say.
right.
Yes. Very good stuff.
Connection there to the myth of Atalanta, the woman who ran the race and was distracted by the golden apples?
Not that I'm aware of.
Maybe in the temptation of the kings of Numenor. Maybe I'm stretching. I don't know.
I don't know what the connection between Atalanta's name is and Atlantis. So I know Atlantis derives ultimately, I believe, from the Atlas Mountains, which border the Atlantic Ocean.
Yeah,
Indeed.
it's just fascinating that his mythology or his world building had roots in the real world and the meaning of the words. I mean, the fact that you go back to words and the importance of words, and whether it's a created language or existing language, it's just kind of interesting that there's that intersection in this particular moment.
Yeah, absolutely. But I'm sure it's more typical of Tolkien's inventiveness than we realize, because he spent a huge amount of time working on his languages. I suspect probably as much time as he spent working on the fiction that they were associated with.
Indeed. I can't imagine what physical place he ever saw or imagined would have inspired Thane Gorodrim. In reading the Silmarillion and in looking at Karen Wynne Fonstad, her maps in the Atlas of Middle-earth, they were just physically impossible to have been on the surface of any normal planet that we would live in. I've always wondered about that. Do you have any insights on these great dark towers of Melkor? If they were that tall, they would have been visible across the entire planet from continents away.
It's not entirely clear how tall Tolkien thought they were, because I think the only illustration we have of them is a drawing he did of the Vale of Tol Sirion, and in the background there is something that must be Thangorodrim, but it looks almost as though Tolkien's drawn it and then not really been sure whether he's made it too big or not. So, but he does describe them as kind of piled up volcanic slag, So again, this is his obsession with well, a mixture of the two things: industrialization and volcanism.
Kind of like what Peter's problem had with maybe I've made that dragon too big. No, maybe I need to make that dragon 20 times bigger. The dragon's not big enough. Let's make that dragon bigger.
Well, yeah, I mean, Peter Jackson's Barad-dûr is, I think, far taller and thinner than Tolkien's would have been if he'd drawn any more than a tiny section of it.
Yes.
So, John, I'm really curious what your opinion is on New Zealand as an analog for Middle Earth, given that it's obviously a place that Tolkien never had a chance to visit in his lifetime.
Yeah, honestly, I have heard people saying, so is there lots about New Zealand in this book? You know, and being apparently rather annoyed with me that there is no New Zealand in this book. Yeah, it's a beautiful place, stunning place, and very suitable for certain scenes. But I always felt that the Shire really ought to be filmed somewhere in England, or somewhere without mountains in the background for a start. You know.
Yes, thank you. There's that wide shot where Frodo and Sam are walking through that field, and I say to myself, no. There's no mountains that close to the Shire like that.
I was watching this with a friend, and he swore out loud in the cinema when we saw this at the London premiere.
Although once you get down to the Southern Alps, when it's time for them to be crossing the mountains, then it works. And then, of course, there's volcanoes everywhere. So if nothing else, I can't help thinking that Tolkien would have loved the fact that you have mountains, the Southern Alps on the South Island, and then on the North Island, you have all that volcanic, volcanoes everywhere, the mud pools, and all of that would have just fascinated him. I think he would have enjoyed it.
Yeah.
When a number of years ago, when we were doing an interview with Brian Sibley, and we traveled out to Salisbury to do an interview with the late author Terry Pratchett. That is the place where I recognized the Shire most strongly, was in the Salisbury area. I mean, we were getting outdoor footage of, the White Horse and the beautiful hills and the green swards, and it was so amazing. But just the little place where Terry Pratchett lived, his adorable little house that had a tiny little observatory with a telescope out in the yard, which was filled with beehives and grasses and wildflowers. It was so Shire-like where Terry Pratchett lived. I've always imagined that they would have been great friends if they'd ever known one another. And I agree with you. There's something about the area of England in that Salisbury area, and a lot of other places that would have been the perfect place to shoot photography.
One of the things that's so compelling about that, though, is that there are pockets of places like that in so many parts of the world. I mean, I lived in Austin, Texas for a very long time, and just south of Austin, we had a Rivendell Cafe. And Central Texas is the hill country, and it's very green, rolling hills, and it felt incredibly Shire-like there.
So this has always made me wonder about, people from different climates, different physical landscapes, different cultures, how it is that this, something that I see as being very English, because it's what I'm familiar with and what he was familiar with, how that translates seemingly so well, so that everyone makes it their own. Everyone knows something that they can associate it with.
Well, and I'd like to think that he would have appreciated that, and that he was inspired by all of this international mythology, these archetypal figures, and in our contemporary society, the way that we want to see ourselves in superheroes and comic books and in our fantasy worlds. It's all about creating places and characters that are where the idea that that a character has to look a certain way, or that a place has to be in a certain geographical location, isn't really the the way that I think of how the story should be told. It should be told in a way that is accessible and reflects all of us.
Indeed.
Cliff,
Yes.
we have about 5 minutes and we haven't really touched on the Amazon series.
Well, there is not a lot of news to tell, except that in terms of the worldwide public health crisis, we have continued assurances by looking at the data that New Zealand has created a much safer, COVID-free environment where they have no new cases, and they have seemed to have curbed almost completely now the spread of the coronavirus. But now there's this rumor circulating that many of the staff, actors, and folks working on the production are going back to start filming, but we don't know for sure when they're going to start all of that filming again. Again,
the Avatar crew has gotten permission to already come in, and so it's just, I know New Zealand is controlling their visa process right now, obviously for health reasons and everything, and whether or not people would have to quarantine. So I know that that's getting ready. And as far as storylines, I'm still fond of the fall of Numenor, but obviously we have to have Sauron meddling as in people's lives in Numenor for that to fall, for them to happen. So obviously the building of the rings, for me, is the story that I feel either the forging of the rings or the temptation and the fall of Numenor is the story we're going to end up getting, I think.
I would think so too. Since the second age goes across so many thousands of years, perhaps they'll do some shuffling of the timeline, and we'll get some flashbacks that tell us about the establishment of Numenor. But my instincts are telling me that they're going to go right towards the end of that era with Anatar appearing, his relationship with Celebrimbor, and the elves in Holland, and their robust relationship with the dwarves of Moria at the time. I believe we'll learn a lot more about Galadriel and Celeborn, and Gil-galad, characters who we have never seen. We see Gil-galad for maybe 3 or 4 seconds in the Fellowship of the Ring, and his spear, which is Aeglos. Is that correct? And I always say these things wrong, but I would.
Aeglos.
Aeglos. Thank you. I try my best. It's early for some of us, but yeah, the whole thing about the forging of the rings and everything. If you want to get success out of this adaptation, I'm very curious how far they're going to go forward or backward within the second age. But on social media posts, all the actors and actresses are showing their copies of the Silmarillion, which we don't believe they have a license. We're not aware that the Tolkien estate allowed the Silmarillion as, it's an anthology of great things and stories, but we're not aware that it was licensed. So people have speculated, what are they reading the Silmarillion for? When they're going, the only thing that would be relevant, I think, is the Akalabeth. What do you guys think?
Well, it is the only thing that would be relevant, unless you were going to dig even further back into the first age. But yes, the rights thing is the big question.
Yeah.
If they only have the rights to the Lord of the Rings and what's in the appendices, there's very little in there, really, on 2 or 3 pages, including a list of kings.
Oh yeah, and that list of kings, I mean, sure, you can't write a whole story just based on a name.
No, so of course I'm a book purist. I would really, if they have to spoil it all by making a film or series out of it.
Oh, bless your heart.
And use real stories.
then I would rather they stick to the printed versions, and that would mean, of course, that they ought to look at what's in Unfinished Tales, where we have the story of Aldarion and Erendis, which is fascinating itself, and the Akalabeth and the Silmarillion. But if they aren't allowed to do that, then how do they make it true to Tolkien? And it's the Tolkien estate that's partly behind this. So it seems to be a difficult circle to square.
Welcome to our world,
I think that it's really interesting to note that of the cast that has been announced, a few of them have had characters named. Now, that doesn't mean that those might not be fake names that are going to be changed later, and they're just trying to keep it secret. But of the only one that is a known name to us is Galadriel. So I would love to see, especially given, what they chose to include in the Lord of the Rings films about Galadriel. There's definitely the implication that there's so much more to her story, and as we know, she has an incredible story. I think that I would love to see her be a really central figure.
Abby, you had an interesting story about one of the actresses. Could you tell us?
Yeah, I got a chance to talk to no, I'm not like remembering.
Sophie, no.
Sophia, yeah. And I sent a message to her about, being super excited that she is seemingly uncharacteristic as one of the characters in the show. And so she was very excited to be noticed, and hopeful that her diversity actually brings a little bit to the stories that are there, especially since we haven't really gotten a chance to see much diversity in any of the previous movies. So I'm excited for whatever she brings, depending on what character they're gonna have her as. And I'm pretty sure she's very excited. She wouldn't give me any little tidbits, but she was glad that, the Amazon set was doing everything that they could to bring as much representation to this television series as possible. So I think for me, that's definitely something to look forward to. I'm also wondering how many episodes they're going to have in this first season, thanks to our worldwide pandemic that has happened. If they're going to end up cutting some of the episodes, especially since the cost of filming has probably tripled, at this point, and making sure that everyone stays safe on set, or if they're just gonna take the budget and run with it, and we'll see what magic they'll make.
Because the one advantage of Amazon is having a budget that can withstand something like COVID.
It could all be filmed through Palantir, though, couldn't it? From people's different homes.
I love that.
Yeah, I mean, that
would be hilarious.
Hasn't the budget gone up?
With Saruman.
Hasn't the budget gone up since the last time we had a conversation? I think it was like $5 billion now, or am I wrong about that?
No.
I haven't heard that, but that wouldn't be surprising, because as a company, they're floating $1 billion every month.
I mean, well, Amazon is in Seattle, and it is literally gone into the trillionaire market. So since the pandemic happened, yes, trillionaire. You heard that right.
I know.
Wow.
It's mind-boggling. I'm also eagerly looking forward to much more representation, and focusing on the Numenorians and their many, many travels across Arda will probably allow these writers and storytellers to take us to see so many different people and places that we've never seen before. We can even look at it with a bit of like, were the Numenorians colonizers, and what were the negative and positive impacts that they had with other peoples in Middle-earth? They have a lot of fertile ground which could ring true to us. And that kind of applicability is what Professor Tolkien was really all about, as we know.
I think that would be gone.
I think it would be a really interesting story, especially with the act of colonization, and how they can literally bring that to like today's stories, or at least the stories of current history. I think that would be a beautiful tie-in, so that people can actually see our world now connected to these stories. And I think it would also give more interest to.
Absolutely.
And with that, I do want to bring our panel to a close. We need to, but we would be remiss if we didn't note the passing of a few important people in the past 6 months or so.
Yes.
And I can't remember exactly when did Christopher Tolkien pass?
I believe it was early January.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
It was not long after Tolkien's birthday when we had our worldwide Tolkien toast
That's
on
right.
the 3rd.
It was just a few days. Yeah, it was about a week after that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And then, of course, the passing from COVID-19 of the dialect coach for the Lord of the Rings movies, Andrew Jack. And it has been noted that his wife is the acting dialect coach for Amazon, which I think is kind of a beautiful continuation, because obviously, as we know, any big show where you're gathering cast from around the world, you need a dialect coach to make sure that everyone's accents sort of sound and work together with each other. And then finally, Cliff, I don't know if you would like to address the most recent passing.
It's indeed very strange timing. Sir Ian Holm, who is a beloved actor and performer in radio, stage, television, and film, has passed away, who brought to life in 6 films a version of Bilbo, which probably will be forever visually cemented to generations of people, much more so than Martin Freeman. I have not to knock Mr. Freeman, who is a delightful man, but Ian Holm, who previously was performing as Frodo in Brian Sibley's radio adaptation of The Lord of the Rings. And bless Mr. Sibley, he's a friend of ours and a friend of the community of ringers around the world. But I find it personally difficult because Ian Holm was such a tremendous actor, and there was such a gentleness in his version of Bilbo that also did not go away from the scary bits. He was not afraid to let us know that Bilbo was still tormented and yet still trying to find his own peace. And I'll never forget that. And it's personally moving because my story with Tolkien is involved with my brother, my older brother, Sean Broadway, who passed away on April 1st. But my exposure to reading The Hobbit as a small boy was because my brother had it and I could not get it out of my brother's hands. It was this great thirst. I had always the greatest thirst to read his Doctor Strange comics or his copies of Conan the Barbarian or T.H. White and J.R.R. Tolkien. And it all began there. So there you see my brother's flag behind me from the Veterans Administration. It's unusual because after COVID happened, we were not able to properly say farewell to my brother until the day that Ian Holm died. And so it seems rather fitting to me that there's some kind of connection between it all, perhaps. But it's an interesting thing to think, oh, the Peter Jackson movies are long gone. There's not much going on in Tolkien fandom. But month by month, year by year, we continue to have new posthumously published books. The last one, so wonderful, from Christopher Tolkien. We have new scholarship from you, John Garth, and from other people who are part of our extended family. So there's never a dull moment in Tolkien fandom. It just keeps going forward on and on. And I think that's the part of it that's most interesting to me, is that future generations of younger people are guaranteed to crack open that book and have exposure to the delight and the wonderment of Tolkien. No matter what happens, the energy of the fandom is perpetual. I find it very fascinating. I think we all do. Yeah.
Yes. All right. And with that, I believe we are signing off. Thank you, Nicole and Abby and Cliff, and especially to you, John Garth, and best of luck on this book release. I know you can't get out there and do the tour that you normally would probably do to promote something like that, but I hope that we are able to help you get the word out, because I can't wait to add some things to my bucket list of travels.
I have to say that the responses to the book from people who have it have just been fabulous.
Oh, awesome. That is great. All right.
I can't wait to get a copy. Thank you so
Yeah.
much.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Um,
Fun.
Thank you for your time, everyone.